I want to start by asking you what inspired you to write this book, and talk a little bit about what you talk about in terms of public health prevention, public health approach to working in terms of the issue of gang violence.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming out, and thanks to Prevention Institute. This is a marvelous organization, and I want everybody here to support it. And happy birthday! That's fantastic that you're coming up on this celebration. Now I've forgotten the question that you asked me, but I will make up an answer to it nonetheless, because the reason that I wrote the book was precisely because when you start to approach 60, you start to lose your memories. And I've been working full tilt for 30 years, and I said, you better get this stuff down on paper, you're not going to remember it. For me, I'm a civil rights lawyer. I thought I would be doing Thurgood Marshall's law firm, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, for the rest of my life. I really was kind of born to be a lawyer there. And I'm a good lawyer. I like fighting. Even in my pastime, I do taekwondo. There's something wrong with me because, you know, litigators, I was born to be a litigator if I was going to be any kind of lawyer at all, because I like to fight. And, you know, I wish I were as evolved as the Quakers. I'm not. And so I have to admit that I like being a litigator. But what I've had to learn is you got to know when to fight, you got to know when to cooperate. And so this book is about my journey. It's in the guise of a memoir, but it's really a book about the mission that we've been on. And it's a mission to give the poorest kids a fair shot in life. And as a civil rights lawyer, what was astounding to discover 15 years into my career was that without the right to safety, there are no other civil rights. So when I would go into the poorest areas of LA, the poorest square blocks of the barrio or the ghetto in LA, it's not the whole ghetto, it's not the whole barrio. It's 4 and 5 square blocks where mail can't get delivered because the gangs are having a war, the gunfire. Or where we had 3 kids get shot while they were sleeping because the bullets came through the drywall and shot them while they were asleep. It's where the water meters can't get read for 3 days because there's gunfire. It's where the children, the hot zones are where our kids actually test. When you do that RAND, World Health Organization test that Deborah Prothero-Stiff pioneered to measure trauma in war zones, well, we hired RAND to measure 4,000 of our poorest kids in LA. They tested higher than the soldiers returning from Fallujah duty in Iraq. It was chronic exposure to trauma, chronic exposure to violence. And so that became the focus, inadvertently, because I was doing what most normal civil rights lawyers do. I was suing police departments, and I was suing school boards, and I was, you know, we were doing what most litigators do, which is you find, it was good social justice work, but it was pretty traditional. Employment discrimination, promotion discrimination. You know, and then we got to LA and we realized we had Rodney King's beating, and then we had a riot once those cops got exonerated, and it cost over $1 billion. It was the biggest race riot in the history of the United States. And LAPD just kept tripping us up, and finally I said, you know what, we're just going to have to make a practice out of this. And I filed 7 class action lawsuits against LAPD in a 4-month period, and we just decided to go to war with them. Because we needed constitutional policing. You can't provide economic development. You can't provide any of the other rights if you don't have the right to be safe, and if you don't have the first of all freedoms, which to me is the freedom from violence. That to me is the first freedom. And the first civil right is the right to safety. So this book is about the quest for the right to safety and freedom from violence. 4, urban core communities. It doesn't mean that the lessons we learned can't be applied to the violence that happens in rural America. Our methamphetamine economies, where children, you can't even see the children. At least in the city, you can see the kids. But in rural America, you gotta find them first. And so it's a different challenge. But a lot of what we've learned can be applied there too. And I wrote this book because, I joke when I say I wrote it because I'm gonna be 60 pretty soon, and I was afraid I wouldn't remember the conversations. I was afraid I wouldn't remember the epiphanies that I've learned over the last 30 years, and you never have time to learn what you learned. You're just on to the next case, you're on to the next crisis, you're on to the next initiative, you're on to the next mayor's race, you're on to the next everything, and I never take time to think about what we've learned, and this book was an attempt to do that. So I thank you so much for coming out. I've been told it's a good read. I've been told that, I can't believe a lawyer wrote this, it's actually interesting, which says something about legal writing. But I didn't write it as a lawyer. I wrote it as a warrior, and I wrote it as a woman who likes to tell stories. And I did it through those crystalline moments where you're having a conversation with your enemy, and all of a sudden the light bulb goes on over both your heads. And I wrote it in terms of the epiphanies, those moments where my soul went through an earthquake, and where I finally realized, oh, I need to go this way. So it's like it's like 20 of those moments strung together, and then in the context of our journey, and by our, I mean my clients, I mean some of the neighborhood kids. There's so many neighborhoods in LA. I mean, LA is 500 square miles, and the county is 4,000 square miles, and I hated to leave San Francisco and Oakland, because San Francisco and Oakland have a soul. I don't think LA has a soul. And so you're trying to save something you're not sure exists. But what I do know is that LA has 850,000 very, very poor children who are trapped in gang zones. And a gang is nothing but a socialization for emasculated men who have been told they're never going to belong anywhere. And so they create their own society of masculinity and power. And as one young kid told me, look, lady lawyer, ain't no men around here got women, cars, and money except the gangsters. I'm going to be a gangster. That's what one youngster told me. And I thought, oh my gosh, do we have a long way to go? And as a feminist, I am the Black Murphy Brown. I am most men's worst nightmare. But even a feminist can look at a community and say, if you take the men out of a community, that community dies. And when I went into these communities, feminist though I am, I'm a female chauvinist. I love men. It just means that I'm quite sure there's a superior gender and that I'm a member of it, and that that's my bias, and I have to claim it, and I have to be very careful to be very fair to the men who are around me. I mean, it's not a question of whether we have biases or not. It's a question of whether you understand what your bias is, and do you compensate for it to make sure it doesn't affect anybody, right? That's how I see it, as being one human being to another. So I'm very open about that bias, and I have to constantly compensate for it. And the men who work for me will tell you that I'm very, very fair. But it has to be a conscious thing on that, because otherwise I'll be making decisions in the ladies' room, and the men won't even know that we've made the decisions. And I don't mean to be sexist. I really don't. And that's not my intent. I'm trying to be fair. But as a feminist, it's awfully hard to be around underclass men. And I was very, very happy when they decided to call me Lady Lawyer, because it could have been a whole bunch of other things they could have decided to do. So the chapter in here that's about Lady Lawyer was after I had wandered down to Jordan Downs Housing Project after the riots, the Rodney King verdict riots. And I realized that I had not been down to any of the black housing projects or Latino housing projects. And I said, okay, I've been here 7 months, I should get down there. And I just joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in LA. And so I got my little dented Civic. I have a Colombo theory of cars, that the more dented your car is, the more it's worth when it gets stolen, because it will get stolen. So I drove this little tin can of a Honda Civic that had dents, and the bumper was missing. It was pitiful. But I went down, it's about 7 miles south of downtown LA, took Century Boulevard, and I was meeting Mercedes Marquez, a lawyer I litigate with whom I litigate, and Mercedes said, look, we got to go down there because the Latino residents are being terrorized by the African American residents, and African Americans don't want Latinos coming into the housing project, the black housing project. So you and I have to go down there and explain to the African Americans that they have to be nice to the Latinos. I said, oh, this is going to go well. I left court, federal court, because I was in front of a Republican judge. I had on a St. John's knit suit with Ferragamos and more pearls than Barbara Bush. For women, 90% of our first impression is what we look like. And so I have learned that when you're before these old-fashioned judges, you figure out, are they still in love with their wives? And if they are, you dress like their wives, right? So here I am, looking like Miss Republican. I was out doing Condoleezza that day with all of the fluff and the floof, and my hair was on top of my head, and these power earrings. It was a ridiculous getup. But it worked. I won the case. So I go down, I get out, I'm on Grape Street, I get out of the car, and I find Mercedes, and Mercedes is waving. She says, oh my God, what kind of getup is that? I said, just shut up, I had to be in federal court today. Long story short, we go into this gym, and it's chairs just like this, big gym. We walk up to the front, and Mercedes introduces herself, and a woman gets up and cusses Mercedes out. And I thought, oh, this is going worse than I thought. I tried to take over, and I said, excuse me, could I introduce myself? My name is Connie Rice. I work at the NAACP. Mrs. Tolliver got up. NAACP my ass. And she reamed me a new one. She started out with, you light, bright, damn near white bitch, and it went downhill. These women were livid with us. And they had the right to be. And because she was a prospective client, I said, yes ma'am, you're absolutely right. She said, where were you? You light, bright, damn near white bitch, where were you when I had to put my babies to sleep in a bathtub because the bullets were coming through the wall? Where were you when my son got gunned down by LAPD and he didn't even do anything? Where were you? And she had a long list of where were yous. And what she was saying was that you abandoned us, you've left us in this hellhole, and you're coming here to ask us to treat folks who are being put into our little corner, and you're asking us to share the crumbs that we have, and you've left us in this war zone, and you have the nerve to come down here and ask us for something. So I said to her, to Mrs. Tolliver, I said, you're right. Middle-class black Americans have left you. We abandoned you. And you have a right to be angry. Now, you can finish cussing me out, or you can tell me how to help you. I'm here, I can help you, or I can leave. It's up to you. Totally up to you, and I'm fine either way. So another lady stands up. She just tears streaming down her face, and she said, we just can't take this anymore. We can't live here like this anymore. We can't walk, our kids can't go to school, we can't sleep in peace at night. They're fighting over direct turf. But right now, we got the Bloods and the Crips, and they're trying to negotiate a truce. Will you help our men? Will you help them find a way? I said, where are they? She said, they're out in a trailer in the back of Markham Middle School. And so that's how I got my first marching orders. From the community. They said, help our men stop the violence, as one lady said. Just help our men. And I thought, oh, this is going to go even worse than this thing. I got up from there and I said, where is Markham? I found Markham. Remember the get-up that I'm in? St. John's suit, more pearls, and Barbara Bush. I find my way to Markham. I find my way to this portable trailer out in the back of this middle school. It's one of the worst middle schools in the country. I think 75% of the kids get Fs. They still do. I knock on the door. Opens up, this guy in a wife-beater undershirt, his pants down below his knees, I mean, you know, just the whole, every stereotype you can think of. Young gangster, he's got a red bandana wrapped around his bicep, so he's a blood, obviously. Stupidly, I greet this young man by saying, hi, my name's Connie Rice, I'm an attorney, and I'm here to help. He slams the door in my face. I said, okay, the women have cussed you out, the men have slammed the door in your face, you're just striking out all over the place. But I heard them talking behind the door, so I waited. And the door opened. But it opened wide this time, and it was wall-to-wall gangsters, and they were festooned in their bandanas. This side was red, biceps around their heads, you know, so it's like the UN flags, right? They're sporting their flags. And then on this side was purple and blue for the Crips. Bloods, Crips. I wasn't stupid enough to go into the trailer, but I'm still standing there at this door and I'm looking at this panorama of gangsters. And I again announced by that, so one of them leans over and says, yo, you a lawyer? I said, yes, I'm an attorney. And so another one says, I said, can I help you in any way? And another one of them, I mean, this guy, his arms were bigger than a tree trunk. I mean, this guy was huge. He said, yeah, you can help us. I said, what can I do? He said, you know that agreement between the Jews and the Arabs? I said, would you be referring to the Sinai Accords between Egypt and Israel? And he said, yeah, that one. I said, yes, I know where to get that. And he said, bring us the agreement between the Arabs and the Jews. He said, if they can get along, we can get along. That was my first assignment. So I trotted off on my Ferragamos and my St. John's suit and my pearls and found my car. And this big guy comes running out of the trailer after me. Yo, Miss Rice, Miss Rice. He introduced himself as Fred Williams. He said, my name is Fred Williams. I'm a gang intervention expert. I'm conducting the truce negotiations. Don't come down here again without calling me. I will be your escort. He was the first gang intervention worker I linked up with. So the next day I came down with the Sinai Accords in tow, 25 copies apiece, and I called Fred and I said, well, I'm at Century and Grape. I said, meet me at the corner. That began my journey through gangland. And I have yet to leave. Because while I was there, as strange as it was, as alien as I looked, as white as I seemed in that environment, I belonged there. Because that's where there were no civil rights. That's where there was no freedom from violence. And it was awfully easy to be marching into court winning cases. But here's what I learned. I was winning my cases while my clients were losing their lives. And I had to change how I did what I did. So I began that journey through gangland, and at the time, we were at war with LAPD. Remember, we just had the Rodney King riot. I had just filed 7 class actions on top of the 3 that we already had. I also was suing the Sheriff's Department and Compton Police. I mean, I was just saying, we had a war with the police. And we did the regular employment discrimination, abuse of force, constitutional violations of every kind you can imagine. And that litigation was round the clock. Round the clock. I think I slept an average of 2 hours a night, and there were days when I wouldn't sleep at all. Kevin and I would take turns sleeping. Bill and Lee, who was also my partner, every third day he would do an all-nighter. So when you have a small law firm and you're kind of like Robin Hood Law, Sheriff Nottingham has the wealth of the crown, but we were David and Goliath, and we had the slingshots. And we had to beat big law firms, and we had to beat the city and the county, and we had to force them to acknowledge, you've got police who are abusing people. You've got police who treat the black community and Latino community as targets. They do not see the human beings who live there as human beings. And they have racial contempt, and they have class contempt, and they treat people like dirt. And we wanted to stop. That's what those lawsuits were about. They were for dignity, and they were for humane treatment. And we needed the police to protect these people, not torment them, not prone everybody out, not frisk and stop everybody, not take every black male and emasculate him. You know, just could you stop this hostile racism? I don't use the word racism very much. I have to save it for when I'm in Mississippi. And I have other, there's a scale. There's racial hostility, there's racial ignorance, there's obtuseness, there's all kinds of things. But when I say racism, it's got to be pretty bad. It's got to be Mississippi burning level for me to use that word. And I could use that word with LAPD. It was really ugly. So that's how I started with Gangland. Now, if you fast forward 25 years, every gray hair that I have, I've earned. I think LAPD gets half of them, the gangs get the other half of this gray hair. To tell you where I am now, the last call I got on my cell phone this afternoon was from Chief Beck. I've gone from being a warrior against the police to having LAPD as my best partner. I now have a parking space next to the chief of police. And I have a badge. They gave me my first book party, and they insisted on giving it in the police headquarters. I had 500 cops there to buy my book. And TV stations were there because it was such an odd party. You know? But how did I go from being their worst nightmare? And it was intense. There were nights when I would get calls from cops, the good cops, and they would call me from payphones. It tells you how long ago it was. They'd call me from payphones, and they would whisper, Miss Rice, don't go down to Watts. Graveyard's gunning for you. I would get warnings from the good cops that the bad cops were getting ready to kill us. They were so angry with what we were doing to them in court that the graveyard, they call them graveyard, the outlaw cops that used to do curbside executions, who were really, if they had been in Guatemala, they'd have been doing the death squads, those kinds of cops, total outlaws, who will actually kill other cops if they tell on them. LAPD had quite a number of those kinds of officers, and the good cops, black, white, Latino, didn't matter, all the women were good. But the men, my bias, I know. Miss Rice, this is Commander so-and-so, I can't tell you who I am. Don't go down to Southeast tonight. You won't be safe. Miss Rice, graveyard's moving on you tonight. Don't go down there. I mean, I would get these, and they were so scared of their fellow officers who were rogues, they were whispering in a phone booth as if their colleagues might hear them. So that's how intense it was. And to go from that to where I am today, where I'm like the queen of LAPD, is ridiculous. The police are now my best partner. When we did our big game report, 1,000 pages, the chapter in here is a call to action I decided that, okay, if I did a lawsuit, it would cost $1 million, and 20 years later, we still wouldn't have what we wanted. I needed something that was faster, that would have more sweeping impact. And so sometimes you can use an academic report that way, if you know how to move it politically. So we got Martin Ludlow to have an ad hoc committee on gang violence, and he couldn't get the city council. So they decided to put out an RFP for a big report on why LA couldn't keep its kids from joining the gangs. Not only couldn't keep its kids from joining the gangs, LA over 25 years had spent $30 billion with a B. $30 billion with a B on a war on gangs. And it had 10 times as many gangs and over 100,000 gang members. I call that failure, colossal failure. And so we did a report that documented what this 30-year war on gangs and war on drugs had done in these poor communities, how it hadn't increased public safety, it hadn't reduced drug use, it hadn't reduced gang joining or gang presence, and in fact had multiplied everything geometrically. So we called it stuck on stupid. And there's a chapter in here called stuck on stupid. It's one of my favorite phrases. It gets to people, it makes them sit up and take notice. And I got a whole bunch of folks to do this report. I got about 11 retired gang cops, and I called Wes McBride, who was an old sheriff's cop, and he had just retired. He'd been on the force for 40 years. He'd been a sheriff's deputy for 40 years, and he had pioneered being a gang officer, and I had sued him. I liked him the first time I sued him. And I called Wes, and he says, I'm retired. I still don't like you. Why are you bedeviling me still? I said, Wes, I need your help. And he said, what are you doing now? I said, we're doing a report. We're going to try and get the city and the county to change how they deal with the gangs. And he cussed me out some more, and then he said, you know what, Connie, I'm probably going to help you. I'm probably going to do this because I just retired. He said, do you know what I did the last week before I retired? I said, what? He said, I arrested the grandson of the man I first arrested when I got 3 weeks out of the Sheriff's Academy. And I arrested the dad 10 years ago. He said, I've destroyed 3 generations of that family, and I've done nothing to help them. He said, I'm going to help you on this report because it may be my way of getting redemption. He really felt kind of guilty about it. This is an old gang cop, but he understood what it meant to put 3 generations of a family's men in prison. He said, if that's all I've done, what have I done? So we had a whole bunch of LAPD and sheriff's cops. We had a gang anthropologist and her colleagues, Georgia Leap. We had Billy Weiss. We had a number of violence prevention folks that work with the Prevention Institute up here. I had sociologists, nurses. I had, most importantly, Deborah Prothero-Stitz people in LA. And they are epidemiologists who study violence as a disease. Something that the Prevention Institute does. So the smartest thing I did was, I didn't put the cops in charge or the civil rights lawyers in charge. I put the epidemiologists in charge. And they were the public health officials who said, you can't do this as a crime-fighting enterprise, and you can't do this as a suing for your rights enterprise. You need to do this as a public health enterprise. And that created a whole new table. The public health table. You know, it wasn't about Connie kicked my butt in court 10 years ago and I got to defend against that, and you know, you arrested my father 15 years ago and I hate you for that. And you could leave all that baggage at the door because we had a public health approach that we could go after. And that table created these alliances. I mean, I'll never forget, we got done with this report. It's 1,000 pages long. That's what happens when you put lawyers with a whole bunch of other academics. The report's going to be real long. And it was very well sourced. It hit at a time when the press really paid attention. So we had 3 weeks of headlines when we issued this report. So it wasn't something they could bury. The politicians usually bury these reports. The trick is, how do you do a report and not have it become a doorstop? How do you take a report and flip it into an action juggernaut, into a vehicle for change? It's very hard to do, but one thing that I'm good at, I'm good at a number of things, but one thing I'm really good at is figuring out how to maneuver something politically into a political platform so that you can get something done politically. I'm pretty good at figuring out how to manipulate the powers that be, to force them to pay attention to something and to act on something. That's a good skill. Because you got plenty of other folks who know the science and the sociology and all that, and they can write great reports. But you got to have somebody who understands how to force the mayor to adopt this, how to force the city controller to back it. And this time, I had Chief Bratton, I had Sheriff Baca, I had the DA, Steve Cooley, I had the city attorney. I had all of my usual opponents, and they were flanking me left and right. I didn't even have my progressive colleagues with me. I only went into the rooms with my conservative colleagues, my conservative allies, because the politicians are terrified of the police. They're afraid of being called soft on crime. And the mayor was so angry about this report because he said, "You're trying to make me the gang mayor, Connie. They'll Willie Horton me. I'm Latino. You can't make me the gang mayor. I'm the education mayor." I said, "Antonio, dead kids don't learn. You got to be the mayor who's dealing with the gangs and education." So Antonio was not happy with me, but he finally, and I give him full credit, because when he embraced it, he planted his flags right in the middle of gangland. He went to the hottest hot spots. He said, "We're going to do this. We're going to do what you say. We're going to go straight into the hot zones. We're going to concentrate the resources there in the hot zones. We're going to do wraparound. We're going to do 24/7. We're going to keep every kid in the hot zone safe. We're going to negotiate with the gangs, with the gang intervention workers. We're going to train the intervention workers to become professionals." We did 100 things. There were 100 recommendations. And when I walked in the room with all of the police officials who said, "We can't arrest our way out of this. We have to build these communities. We have to keep these kids safe. We have to keep these environments healthier." You had police advocating for the public health model. And that's what we're doing down in LA. Now, what did we do? We set up a gang reduction and youth development office. Can you believe we're the gang capital of the entire Western Hemisphere, and we had no office that was responsible for reducing gang joining? We now have a gang czar. His name is Guillermo Cespedes. He is brilliant. He is a jazz musician with an MSW. And he doesn't think like a politician. And if you think he's a dilettante, he has recorded with Gato Barbieri. I'm trying to tell you, he is serious, a serious jazz musician, right? But he's an emigre from Cuba. And so he has a unique perspective. He looks like an African-American man, and he is Cuban. So he can bridge the two major tribes, which is something that LA has to have. You have to have somebody who has authenticity with both tribes. I'm an African-American woman, to the manner born. I'm actually Sally Hemings. I don't even have credibility with the African-American communities half the time. So you can't have people like me in there. You have to have, at this critical point in time, as the tribes are negotiating a transfer of power, you have to have the Guillermo Cespedeses. He's our gang czar. He set up this office according to what this report suggested. And what we told them to do was that you have to go into the hot zones, and you have to change the physics in that neighborhood. Because if you change the dynamics in that neighborhood and everybody starts to feel safe, you'll be amazed what happens in these neighborhoods. So the way we did it was through a program we call Summer Night Lights. It's been 5 years we've been doing it. What you do is you go into the hot zones, you go to the parks where the gangs control the park. The gangs control the parks, they control the housing authority, they control a whole bunch of stuff they should not control. But you go into the park with your gang intervention workers and you negotiate with the gangsters and you say, "Look, we're going to keep the park open. We're going to have your grandmothers and your aunts, we're going to have your sisters out here, we're going to have your kids and your grandkids out here. So we suggest you help us make it safe because everybody's going to be out here." And you want to know what the gangs negotiate for? To give us permission to have the program. You want to know what they ask for? Jobs. The gangsters ask for jobs. You know what they want most of the time? They want to go to the fire academy. They want to learn how to become firemen. They love the idea of being firemen. Don't ask me why. I think it's because in prison they have that firefighting program. And it's the one program that has dignity, right? So we called the fire department and told them, guess what, you're going to have to teach some gangsters how to fight fires. And they don't like it, but we force the county to do it. And some of them, when they become police officers, we can't let them become police, but we can send them to the academy and have them go through it. But that's what they asked for. I was kind of surprised that they asked for something that reasonable. You start there, and you know what you do? You go in 4 nights of the week during the height of the summer. It's about 15, 16 weeks long. And you start at dusk. You feed all the kids. I don't have kids, I've got cats, but I understand that if you feed children, they'll do anything you ask them to do. So you feed them, and then you have chess tournaments, and soccer tournaments, and swim team contests, and you have American Idol music contests, and you bring in bands, and there's so much activity in the park that by 2 o'clock in the morning, people still don't want to go home. But you've been there for a good 7 hours, the whole community is there. And guess what? The crime plummets. The gang activity plummets. We measured that in and around the summer night light sites, the gang homicide rate drops 57 to 67%. It's not rocket science. The reason that the gang homicide rate goes down is because they're not killing one another, they're playing chess. I mean, it's not a mystery. It's just that when you realize that even in a gang hotspot, 18th Street, MS, I'm talking about the worst gangs in the country, that when they decide to cooperate with a community strategy, that community becomes safe. And then when the kids are used to having 6 and 7 hours of freedom to run and play and win contests, and you've got both cultures are still matriarchies. Gangsters are not going to act up if their grandmother is there to watch them. Bottom line, when the abuelas and the grandmothers are out there, the men don't act up. They just don't. They're perfect. And in fact, they start helping the gang intervention workers enforce the rules. It's fascinating to watch. The dynamics change. You change the physics in a hot zone. And the kids stay safe for the whole summer. This is our 5th year of doing it. And finally, the national press is beginning to understand. And they post the question this way, it's too bad from Rahm Emanuel, but they say, what's wrong with Chicago and how come LA is getting it right? Because they followed our big gang report. So I've had quite the ride. I've gone from combat, being a gladiator against the police. You gotta have some guts to fight the police. They're kind of scary. But we had to fight them because nobody else could. Only civil rights lawyers have the protection that's needed to fight people with guns. And I don't care whether they're cops or gangsters. Similar cultures in a lot of ways. But I have just had the most amazing ride. And the most amazing career. I got to live life totally on my terms. I wanted to live my life for my work. I didn't want kids, I didn't want a husband, I didn't want any of that. And I've been able to do that. And I've been able to take a huge area like LA, which LA has no soul. I hate to say that, but it has no soul. Oakland has a soul, Seattle has a soul, San Francisco has a soul, LA has no soul. It's too big and too spread out. But if you can make an impact and save children's lives, if you can make an impact and give gangsters a way to turn around, do a U-turn back into society, if you can find a way to get the black gangs and the brown gangs not to create mayhem, if you can create a way so that the little kid in a gang zone doesn't think that the only way to get male power is with a gun and by wearing colors. The day that I realized that children died every day for answering this question the wrong way. When a car of kids drives up to a little one, rolls down the window, and they shout at him, "Where are you from?" And if that child gives the wrong answer, they shoot him. They shoot him. When I realized that children died every day for wearing the wrong color, I said, this has to end. I'm not leaving this earth until every kid in LA can walk to school safely, be in school without being forced into a gang in the bathrooms, and walk home safely. And hopefully be in a home where there's no abuse. Until that day, I can't go earn money. Which means I'm going to end up on Skid Row with a basket myself. And I told LAPD, you're not to take my shopping basket. I will have bought it. But these days, I am, with this book, meeting audiences like you. I'm having the time of my life. At the same time, we still have all this work to do. But what's amazing is that with groups like the Prevention Institute, and the Prevention Institute didn't exist when I started this work. But it tells you the story of where we need to go. We have to keep these kids safe. We have to reduce their trauma. I look at this as a mission of trauma reduction. I look at it as a mission of preventing these ills. And I look at it as growing a community that just gives kids the basics. I'm not asking Watts to become Bel Air. I know we live in a capitalist system. That's not going to happen. My vision is actually kind of pathetic. My brother calls me a Neiman Marxist. Condoleezza and I have the shopping gene. You know, when Katrina hit, I knew where she was. She was at the pre-sales for the Ferragamos. I knew exactly where she was. The people were asking, where is the Secretary of State? I said, where else is she going to be? She's in New York with the pre-sales. I admit it, I'm a bougie, I'm exactly what I look like, an African-American princess, and I make no apology for it, okay? It is what it is. But I also know that part of the legacy of slavery is what we're looking at now. Yes. And so the duty that we all have is to these kids. And I can't go make money until they have basic safety. That's what this book is about. And I've been told it's a really good read because it's funny and it's sad. And it's very human, and it doesn't sound like it was written by a lawyer, I'm glad to say. I did not write it as a lawyer. I would have bored people to death, because that's what law school teaches you. We make sex, death, everything. We make reproduction boring. We make anything boring. That's what you're taught to do at law schools, to make everything boring. So I didn't write it as a lawyer. I wrote it as a woman who has seen amazing things, worked with amazing people, and been extraordinarily privileged to have served some wonderful communities. One chapter in the book is about my work on death row, which is where I started. I often tell law students I did my best work as a student, and it's been downhill since then. But I started in law school. I got a full scholarship, and I had to work 40 hours a week to keep the scholarship. And so I worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and doing habeas petitions, and I learned how to keep someone alive, someone on death row alive. And I've been through one execution, and that experience was, I describe it in the book, and I only give you a tiny flavor of it, but I felt like I'd worked a lifetime. I'd only worked 2 years. I felt like it had been a lifetime. And I had to go down to Parchment, I had to go down to Angola, I had to go to the row where my clients were. And if you can't, well, let me put it this way. It was a crucible in which to learn. It taught me how bad it could get. And it taught me how woefully inadequate our legal system was. If you can't kill people with integrity, then you've got nothing else about your system that has integrity. And it told me how much I had to work, how hard I would have to work to get any kind of equity for those without power. So, I come from an incredible family. I have lived nothing but privilege. I'm exactly what I look like, an African-American princess. And I'm spoiled rotten. And I act like people should be serving me as royalty. You should see me in LAPD. And as a woman, you have to do what Queen Elizabeth did. You have to project your power in a way that can be recognized as female power. And I learned to do that, and I do it every day. Not for myself, although I'm wondering how I'm going to afford my retirement, because you don't get a lot of retirement when you're a civil rights lawyer. But I'll figure that out later. And right now, I'm still in the middle of the violence prevention work. I'm in the middle of helping police departments. I just left Seattle PD after helping LAPD, after suing them and then helping them. I've found that I now have a specialty of persuading police departments that they need to change, and then how to change on their terms. I had no intention of ever having such a specialty, but you end up with skills that you didn't mean to have. And Seattle PD, NYPD, I mean, you know, it's very interesting. I'm spending most of my time with cops these days, and they want to teach me how to shoot, which my father said absolutely no to. So I think I will stop now and let you ask questions, or let you follow up with some questions. Thank you.